Katie from Nerd Church here to provide a little more data about the dogma. In this case, I am going to be following up on a video that I did in an attempt to respond to C.J. Cornwaith's correct observation that currently Catholics are underrepresented in biblical scholarship. And I explained some of the information about that in general, but it also relates to the important question of why, at least in the post-Vatican II era, people have left the church and why people are coming back. Because there are important differences in the reasons why evangelical Christians leave their birth faith and deconstruct, and the reason why Catholics leave their birth faith and deconstruct. And it also sheds some light on why, after literal decades of falling numbers, the Catholic Church is actually starting to see relatively modest growth of about 1% a year, which means that, for every Catholic that dies, we're getting either a baby or a new convert, plus like a little bit extra, which is a big change. So I'd like to talk a little bit today about why that's happening. Now, the first thing that we need to get out of the way is the idea that it's happening over theology, because for Catholics it's not. And indeed, one of the reasons why I started Nerd Church was for the benefit of evangelical scholars who I have heard on stream after stream after stream talking about how biblical inerrancy and realizing that the Bible is not univocal, or something like the doctrine of the Trinity not actually being explicitly in the Bible, or the fact that Jesus in the New Testament never in these exact words says, "I am God." He says, "I'm the Son of Man." He says a lot of stuff. He does a lot of stuff that caused later Christians to conclude that Jesus was God. I happen to think that that's a correct assumption. However, no, it doesn't say that explicitly in the Bible. And this is why a lot of evangelicals, when they get to seminary or when they just start educating themselves about Christian history, really get thrown into a crisis of faith. That isn't something that happens to Catholics, because literally all of the things that I have heard evangelicals say was the tipping point that caused them to leave their faith is something that most Catholics are literally being taught as children in Sunday school, or are hearing on Sunday from the AMBO. I have heard on more than one occasion a priest refer in an extremely offhanded, yeah, we all know this kind of way, to the fact that the earth is about 4.5 billion years old. I have heard people from the pulpit preaching against biblical inerrancy, because if you're a Catholic, biblical inerrancy is an explicit heresy. So that means that when a Catholic starts learning Greek in seminary, it's going to reaffirm, at least up to a certain point, absolutely everything that he was taught as a child. And I'm saying he because, yes, Catholic priests, because Catholics at the current time are only ordaining and acknowledging the ordination of women, to the point that a lot of people got big mad that Pope Leo met with the current Archbishop of Canterbury. even though popes have been meeting with archbishops of Canterbury for a very long time, it's just that this particular archbishop is a woman. And, it opens up the possibility that maybe someday, God willing, if the Anglicans or the Lutherans or the Episcopalians or even the Old Catholics rejoin the Catholic Church, that there might have to be some kind of provision for female ordination. So yeah, female ordination is a big one. Priestly celibacy is another big one. For example, a lot of priests, in some cases, we've even lost a couple of bishops, have left the church or at least stepped down from being clergy and have been voluntarily become laymen again because they wanted to marry. That's another reason people leave. They don't agree with priestly celibacy. Women's ordination is also an issue because a Catholic woman who feels a sincere calling to the priesthood, some of them do still end up in religious life, but an awful lot of them just convert to being Episcopalian or Lutheran or something like that. I don't have statistics, but the data off the top of my head, and I don't want to make up numbers, but there's at least a substantial minority of female Episcopal priests who were who were baptized Catholic, raised Catholic, and then converted so that they could receive ordination as an Episcopalian. So those are things that push us out. And even a lot of women who are like myself, who are actually fine with having a all-male priesthood, really think that women should be allowed to be ordained or consecrated or whatever ceremony and whatever term ends up being deemed appropriate. Hi, Tuco. Yeah, that's not my problem. That's your problem. I was greeting Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, who is the current head of the Inquisition. Well, okay, he's in charge of the dicastery for the Congregation of the Faith, which is the lineal descendant of the Inquisition, and in my heart, he's still the Grand Inquisitor. But I digress. I do that a lot. Forgive me. But the point is that there's a lot, and all of us who want women in the diaconate have absolutely no problem with women serving as lectors or as extraordinary ministers of the Holy Eucharist, which is the very cool official title that's given to the laymen and laywomen who will assist the priest in distributing Holy Communion. So that is a non-issue now because Pope Francis chose to actually change the Code of Canon Law to explicitly say that any baptized Catholic can serve as a lector or as an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion, which to someone like me, who at 7 years old was told that in my new diocese, I was not allowed to be an altar girl, which at the, age of 5 had been my greatest ambition, was to get to serve at the altar. And then when I was 7, we moved to a different state, and I was told, well, no, you can't do that here. To me, that was the Catholic Church saying that they didn't want me. But that had nothing to do with theology, and that had nothing to do with doctrine. Similarly, a lot of people get pushed, and I'm speaking here primarily about people who were born and raised in the late 1970s or the 1980s and 1990s, were raised in a church where the dogmas that really counted were opposition to abortion, opposition to homosexuality, and opposition to divorce. For example, there were a lot of people that I knew that were adults who were kind of like wishy-washy on transubstantiation and the real presence, and who heavily wanted to, cut out devotion to the saints, devotion to the Blessed Virgin. My own members of my own family, who I won't name out of respect because some of them are still Catholic, actually explicitly in my hearing doubted the perpetual virginity of Mary. But they were super duper opposed to abortion and homosexuality, so that meant that they were good Catholics by the definition of, white suburban Catholics in the 1980s and 1990s. That meant that for a lot of my generation, the generation that was born and raised during the papacy of John Paul II and then continued with Benedict, it didn't matter how liturgically conservative you were, how theologically conservative you were, if you were not okay with a lot of very specific moral teachings, you were not welcome. Now, that created problems for a lot of us because when you start reading, say, John of the Cross, John of the Cross was in love with Jesus. And probably if John of the Cross were alive today, John of the Cross would be an out gay man who would be in love with Jesus and who would probably still choose to be celibate as a way of devoting his life to his beloved. The Catholic Church, the Latin Catholic Church, didn't require priestly celibacy until the 12th century. So basically, all of us who were raised on a steady diet of no gay, no divorce, no abortion, our faith got rocked the second we read Thomas Aquinas and found out that according to Thomas Aquinas, abortion, although always a serious matter, didn't actually cross the line into being mortal sin until the baby started kicking. And quickening usually starts happening at around, between 12 and 16 weeks. Which, honestly, is the point where a lot of people feel that someone who is pregnant if you're 5 months pregnant with a healthy fetus, that maybe having an abortion, I mean, there's a lot of people who think that abortion should be legal, who think that, that just for their own personal ethics, that if you're 6 months pregnant, you might as well just have the baby and give it up for adoption, or keep the baby and raise it, rather than having an abortion at 6 months, unless there's some actual medical reason. So if you were told no from the moment of conception, even forms of contraception that might possibly cause a fertilized egg to not implant, and then you discover, well, no, actually the Catholic Church has been arguing about this for years and will probably continue to be arguing this for years, your faith was rocked. So, yeah, there's a lot of us who deconstructed, became less frequently practicing. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have met someone who, if you ask them what their religion is, they kind of laugh and say, well, I was raised Catholic. And, and they still go to church on like Christmas and Easter, but not the rest of the year. Again, these are people who are forced out for social reasons that have nothing to do with theology. Which means that in the Francis papacy and then in the Leo papacy, when there was just that little sliver of inclusion being left open, the second that we went from Pope Benedict saying, I want a small, pure church, to Pope Francis saying, open the doors, todos, 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 we walked back in. And we aren't leaving. And a lot of us are pretty darn conservative theologically and are pretty darn conservative and are pretty darn conservative liturgically. I mean, and this is me speaking for myself. My dream mass is a mass where everything except the readings and the homily are in Latin. I'm fine with the readings and the homily being in the vernacular because that's the important part for the vernacular mass, in my opinion. I'm speaking for myself as a Catholic laywoman. So, entirely Latin except for the readings and the homily, and I would be totally cool if the only man on the altar was the priest. And that's the Mass that I would want to hear on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and I want to hear a priest laying out the doctrinal, theological, and sociological reasons why the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception is something that should be defended. So, I've been talking for quite a while, and I've probably gotten a lot more personal than people necessarily want to hear. But what I'm trying to say is that because Catholics are able to read the Bible critically and are able to learn about church history without having our faith in a way that we're basically, okay, let me rephrase this. I apologize for the sloppiness. I apologize for the lack of editing. Basically, a Catholic is never going to find out that something isn't in the Bible and have their faith shaken because of that. Now, once you're out of the church a little bit, you might start to question some of those dogmas. That happens a lot. I mean, for example, the great scholar John Dominic Crossan quit being a monk to get married and left the Catholic Church because he eventually decided to abandon his belief in the resurrection. But a lot of people, including myself, will point out that he did that knowing that there's at least one example of someone in the Holy Land who was crucified, taken down from the cross, and buried respectfully in a tomb. And no, we didn't find the body. His name was Yonatan and not Yeshua. So, and I hope that wherever Yonatan is, that he is having a better experience than he did in life. But my point is that that nobody, so yes, people may abandon dogma after they quit being Catholic, but very few people actually quit being Catholic because of dogma. And so that's why people leave the church. And that's why people are coming back. And that's why we're probably going to continue seeing people come back. There's also the fact that even when Catholics leave, generally, as I mentioned with all these female Episcopal priests, a lot of times when Catholics leave the church, they either move into just kind of being, regular secular people who occasionally go to church, or so either they become secular, some of them become atheists or agnostic, but a lot of them just like end up doing what dissenting Catholics have been doing for the last 500 years and go off and become Lutheran or Episcopalian or Orthodox. So that's where we are. I hope that I've provided some useful and helpful information. And if I could just offer a final suggestion at the end. Okay, if you're a patristic, no, I'll say that for another video. Bye.